Ruth is a refugee. She has braved the elements, the perils of predators, walked the long, hard road of the wilderness to come to this new land called House of Bread, to live among people who do not know her and who can only describe her as that Moabite woman who came with Naomi back to the village of Bethlehem. Ruth is a refugee because she comes seeking shelter, relief, protection, and a way to find a future with Naomi when there does not appear to be a way for a future. Though Bethlehem means house of bread, for Ruth and Naomi, the cornucopia of Bethlehem's food wealth may not be for them, for they are still hungry. They are still without means, even though this is Naomi's homeland among her kin. And as I said last week, this is how it was for childless widows and homeless foreigners in ancient Israel. They lived their lives on the margins of village life, displaced like exiles, locked in poverty, overwhelmed by loneliness, and uncertain of their belonging to the Israelite community. And this is made very clear when Ruth goes out to the fields to gather grain for her and Naomi's daily meals. She, like the other poor and destitute people, is only allowed to do her grain gathering on the margins of the fields after the village harvesters have done their work, and all the grain that she may gather is what is left over and laying on the ground. They are just like the modern-day refugees, migrants, displaced persons, and exiles who flee their homelands hoping to escape their government's violence, oppression, or the disintegration of their communities, or the unending cycle of poverty and joblessness, hoping to find a place of refuge, a place of safety, of relief from anxiousness, a place of sanctuary from threat, only to discover that life in a refugee camp or life in a new land with a different language and culture is more about living on the margins of a community than it is about the shelter and loving kindness that embraces them to bring them fully into the community, so they too might find their place within the community and find a way to contribute to the well-being of the community. You see, living on the margins, the outside edge of the community, is the place where one might not find any meaningful work, or where one may only find menial work that no one else wants to do, where food might come by trucks, if it comes at all, where clean drinking water is a luxury, medical care is a doctor rationing vaccines and antibiotics by the needleful, and where the growing hostility of the host people is a daily reality and adds to the uncertainty of their future, even if they should dare to imagine they have a future at all. And it really doesn't matter whether the refugee camp is in Chad or Ethiopia, or whether it is living like a refugee in Bethlehem or even in the United States, because each refugee tells a similar tale. Yet one can also be a refugee, a displaced person in exile, without ever leaving one's homeland. One can be a refugee by being a loyal employee who works at the same office or factory for decades, only to be surprised by a pink slip, and then experiencing the bottom falling out of their financial well-being as the savings are gobbled up and the home is lost in unemployment. One can be a displaced person simply by being born into generational poverty, where living on the margin is not a short-time situation, but it is an all-the-time reality. One can be a displaced person by being born into dysfunction, or by simply being so different from everybody else that one does not fit into a community and constantly feels ill at ease, causing one to be vigilant about every word spoken, every gesture made, every laugh, lest one say or do something that makes one stand out in a negative way. One can be a refugee, a displaced person, an exile, if one is perplexed about the present, worried about the future and wondering whether life is worth living at all. And when a person is mired in such difficult and desperate circumstances, what is it that such a person needs to know? What story, what message will bring courage? What truth will empower hope? And the answer to those questions come in this morning's reading from Ruth, pointing us to see that God is actively working to bring redemption and restoration into our lives, even if we do not recognize at first that God is the one actively involved in sustaining our life for a glorious future. Because as Isaiah 56 reminds us, just at the time when the Babylonian exile is ending, Isaiah reminds us that this is the God who gathers people together, who will gather them from north and south, from east and west, and bring them home to God's presence. As Isaiah asserts, some are already gathered home. Some are not yet gathered home. But all will, by the mercy of God, be gathered home. This is the God who gathers and welcomes home the exile, the displaced person, the refugee, through the practice of hospitality that crosses boundaries, that draws people into the community by expanding who belongs in the community, even as it keeps fidelity to the covenant of generosity, loving kindness, and peace. And the very first hint for Ruth and Naomi of this gathering home, this restoration to life, arrives in the person of Boaz, who is Naomi's wealthy relative. And unbeknownst to Ruth and Naomi, Boaz possesses the very resources and character that will be used to bring about a reversal of fortune for them both. In the beginning, Ruth is just out in the field, gleaning enough grain to feed Naomi and herself for however long the grain will last. And she'll come out here all day, every day, to be sure they have food. This is how Ruth is living out her promise and her commitment to be with Naomi, to care for her for the rest of their lives, no matter what happens, as she promised to do as they walked to Bethlehem. And then, of course, Boaz comes out to see how the harvesting is coming along. And he sees Ruth. And he doesn't know who she is. And so he asks about her and discovers how extraordinary a woman Ruth is. And, by the way, she is extraordinary for her self-giving love for Naomi that empowers her to leave everything behind her, including her family, to risk her life caring for Naomi, being Naomi's place of shelter, of safe harbor, of being Naomi's refuge. And recognizing how extraordinary a woman Ruth is, Boaz acts to show her the same compassion and loving kindness that Ruth has shown to Naomi in his own practice of hospitality by offering her lunch, telling her she may drink the same water as all the other members of Boaz's household, giving her a place among the women who are harvesting in the field, making sure she also has more than enough grain by telling the young men to leave a bit more grain behind them as they go about their harvesting, and by protecting her when he tells his young men to leave her alone. In this act of hospitality, Boaz becomes Ruth's refuge, her shelter, her safe harbor, in the same way that God is a place of shelter and refuge. As the psalmist sings about, "Oh, how abundant is your goodness that you have laid up for those who are in awe of you, and have accomplished for those who take refuge in you." And we also hear it in Boaz's blessing of Ruth. "May you have a full reward from the Lord, God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge." But this is only one aspect of the practice of hospitality. Another aspect of this practice is embracing people, bringing them into the community. And Boaz does this by breaking down the barriers, separating this foreign woman from the rest of the village of Bethlehem when he marries her. And by doing so, he draws her into the village, And she then has a place to live, a place to be. She will have a share in God's rich abundance given to this community. She will belong. And she and Naomi will once again have a future. And because they have a present place within this community of Israel, so too will they make a significant contribution to Israel's future in the child who will be born, who will be called Obed, the grandfather of Jesse, the great-grandfather of David, who will become Israel's king. Through all that Boaz is doing in his acts of hospitality and his loving kindness and love for Ruth, God is at work changing Ruth and Naomi's life, blessing their lives, and also blessing the people of Israel with life and a sustainable future. And I have to say that as I was reading this story then this last week of the election season, that seems like it's gone on for longer than a season, I have become convinced that a lesson that we as the people of God following Christ are to glean from this story is that communities grow and thrive by practicing hospitality to those who are seeking shelter, whether they have been living here as refugees, as displaced persons, exiles all along, or whether they have migrated here as refugees, as displaced persons, as exiles, as those who seek protection, relief, safe harbor, who seek a life of well-being and peace among us. And by practicing a hospitality that embraces and draws people away from the margins of the community into the midst of the community so that they may sense that they belong, so that they may sense that they matter, that they have something to contribute to the building up and the sustaining of the community. Because it is in this practice of hospitality that is the antidote to communities becoming inward looking, becoming insular looking, from collapsing in upon themselves and eventually dying. It is a practice of hospitality that crosses boundaries, overcomes barriers separating one person from another, and we're listening. And helpfulness and bearing with each other are marks of this community. Because in that growth, you see, people are not turning away from their differences, but confronting their differences and engaging the otherness of those who are not like us, as Lois Barrett has observed in her work with congregations that are actively transforming their lives together. And it is this practice of hospitality that is also like the monastic hospitality that sees in the stranger Christ's own being and remembers Jesus saying to his disciples, I was a stranger and you welcomed me. And when you welcome a stranger, you welcome me. And while I don't think they would probably say this the way I have said it, and they being the Obama campaign team, I don't know that they would actually say it, that they were practicing hospitality in this campaign season. But I believe it is the practice of this kind of hospitality that led in part to the re-election of President Obama. Because his re-election campaign relied on gathering people across ethnic, racial, age, gender, sexual orientation, economic class, and vocation throughout the nation so that they might trust his vision of the way forward. They created long-term relationships with people so that they knew the names of people living in local communities, in local neighborhoods. And they asked those people to participate in creating a community of people who would vote for Obama and not be swayed by 30-second sound bites and massive ad campaigns. I suspect that if he and his team had not done that, he probably would not have been reelected. And this practice of hospitality by God's people is about replicating an action God has been doing for some time. But unfortunately, we too often ignore it. Even biblical scholars and a fair number of pastors fail to point out or teach that along with the Hebrews who left Egypt were a bunch of other enslaved people who came along with them because it was a good time to get out of Dodge. But those people who came with them also became part of the people of Israel. We also forget that the women in Matthew's genealogy of Jesus include not only Ruth, a Moabite, but include Rahab, a Canaanite woman, and Tamar, a Canaanite woman. And we forget that the church grows and thrives by including Romans and Greeks and people from Asia Minor, as well as people from every class and caste and ethnic group throughout the Mediterranean basin, and that it continued to do that throughout the centuries, until at last it became a worldwide community of faith. And I would also like just to say this. One of the great strengths of this congregation, which has enabled you to thrive and grow over the long history of your presence in this community. As a matter of fact, indeed, it was one of the positive characteristics of this community is that practice of hospitality. And I heard that time and time again in the small group gatherings that met a year ago. This has been a place where people are welcomed just as they are, without having to pass a theological litmus test, are encouraged to participate in the way they choose to participate. They are honored and they are appreciated for the diverse gifts and ability that they bring with them. And they are encouraged by folks to use their gifts and abilities to contribute to the building up and sustaining this community of faith. And I just want to encourage you to keep doing it, to continue practicing hospitality that you have been doing, and to extend this practice to the new pastor that you're going to be calling to come here, and to perhaps consider making it an intentionally radical hospitality that expands those who belong to the community, that welcomes folks to find their place here, that knows people's names, that show a genuine interest in who a person is and what they need and what they have to offer. One that offers refuge and sanctuary, loving kindness, generosity, peace, and that recognizes every person is welcomed as Christ, and that person is bringing the divine presence of Christ into this community, a presence assuring us that Christ will recognize us in the new creation in the same way that Christ has already encountered us in this one, and assuring us that the incarnation is God's hospitality to us, a means of welcoming us, not only as friends, but as family. A radical hospitality, you see, is the real, true transformation. Since by radical hospitality, you as a congregation begin taking on the character of the coming reign of God, where heaven and earth are one, and it is indeed on earth as it is in heaven. May God's blessing of life, of a growing and thriving life, be with you all on this day and all the days to come for eternity. Amen.